A customer of mine brought in this Yard Max wood chipper, and it has a Kohler RH Series engine on it. He bought it for that very reason, because it was a good price, and it had a Kohler engine, which he thought was a good engine. And for the most part, they are good engines, but not this one. As I started working on this more and more, things started to become a little bit more familiar. And I'm like, that cylinder head looks a lot like a Honda, or a Honda clone. And I looked at the block, and it's pretty much the same. The carburetor's the same, but everything on the outside is just a little different. But I've concluded that this is actually probably one of the worst engines that you can get. It's even probably worse than a lot of Honda clones, and I will show you why. So here on the table I have a few things. I have some parts from this Kohler engine. I have parts from a Honda clone. There's one right there. It's a parts engine. And then an actual Honda engine, a GX200, which is what this engine is based off of. So to start off on the road of disappointment for this Kohler engine is going to be the muffler. And this is probably the most god-awful muffler design I've ever seen in all my years of small engine repair. And what it is two pieces of sheet metal stamped together with a crappy baffle inside, and then they called it a day. No gasket either. It didn't even come with an exhaust gasket on this engine. And actually, this is the very reason why this engine came in the first place. Do you see this fairline crack right here? Well, that is not supposed to be there, and that's because this muffler was rattling on the cylinder head. And what had happened is that from the factory, the bolts that attach this directly to the cylinder head, they squeeze down on this sheet metal and is supposed to sandwich it to the cylinder head to hold it on. Well, there's absolutely nothing in between this piece of metal and this piece of metal. So when the bolt squeezes it, it crushes it and then doesn't actually hold it down anymore. So it rattles, and your first inclination is, okay, maybe the exhaust bolts have come loose, better tighten it. Even though the exhaust bolts are actually already tight. So when you go to tighten it, they snap off. It has snapped off, both of them actually. And what was really baffling is that the bolts that they used were 6mm. 6mm, tiny little bolts. Of course they're gonna snap. On the Honda engines, they use 8mm studs on the cylinder head. Let me show you. Here is the cylinder head from a Honda clone. It is exactly the same as the Hondas, slightly different than the Kohler, but they are absolutely 100% compatible, which is just absolutely funny. But anyway, if we look here at the exhaust, you can see here they use 8mm studs. This one kind of pulled off like a bolt because it's rusted to that, but they're beefier than 6mm. 6mm, come on, Kohler. In an attempt to fix the cylinder head, I tried to stud it, but you know, trying to drill out a broken bolt into aluminum and the drill bit wanders, yada yada, you know how it goes. They didn't even use a gasket for the valve cover, they just siliconed it on, which is real fun trying to get that off. Looking at the cylinder head side by side, they are virtually indistinguishable. You can see the valve covers are a little bit different, but you can actually see the pattern of what it matches on this going around here, but no, they just made it narrower and just called it their own engine. They're virtually identical. They are a little different. Yeah, just the little things, but the cylinder heads are virtually the same. They do have a little bit of different geometry on top, but otherwise the bolt holes line up, the valves are the same. They are literally the same. It is a Honda clone with a Kohler logo on it. By the way, in comparison to this piece of shit, here's an actual Honda exhaust. Okay, it's a Honda clone, but they are the same except for this doodad they put on here. I guess that's an emissions thing. The Honda engines generally don't have that. But these mufflers generally last a long time. Don't really see too many issues with them. Occasionally they rust out, you gotta replace them, but so does every other engine. So when I saw the busted muffler, I'm thinking, well, I could either get a new muffler, which is going to crack again, or I could make my own. And this is just, once again, a Honda clone. I think it's off of a Predator. Another exhaust, and I made my own tube. And I just made it like this so that the housing of the wood chipper would be here. If you were to have the stock exhaust, you can actually see that the exhaust actually protrudes past the back of the block. So you can see on here, here is the side of the Honda engine. It's kind of hard to see, but the muffler actually goes past the gas tank, past the rear sump cover, just a bit, and it's enough where it goes right up against that and you can't actually put the cylinder head on. The next thing that was a pretty much a big shock for me was the air filter housing itself. So this is an absolute joke. This whole shell is made out of flimsy plastic, and the filter is just this flat piece of foam. Now, this is going on a wood chipper that produces a lot of dust and dirt, and you're using a foam filter. That's not going to make the engine last very long. But not only that, these are flimsy. They flex. This thing doesn't attach very well. This thing flexes. The only point of contact are these two bolts right here, these two holes right here, which mounts onto the carburetor. So this whole thing just flexes on here, and you know, when you put them together with the filter in there, and it just feels cheap, very cheap. You can see that this doesn't even line up. It just has so much flex. And when I took this off, there was actually dirt going right past the filter. It's almost like the filter is not even there. Contrast to literally every single Honda clone and Honda engine out there, or Honda-based engine. Predators are technically not a clone, but they're based on the Honda design. But moving on from that, this is a proper air filter. This is just a standard air filter that comes on this. This engine came off of a power washer, so they don't really experience a lot of dust. But still, at least, they had a paper element air filter. You can see the paper element behind the pre-cleaner. And it is rigidly mounted to the engine. That thing is not coming off. This thing just flexes around. You can actually see it while the engine's running. The whole thing is just vibrating. I'm just shocked that it actually says Kohler on it. So I'd like to talk about the controls for a bit. So Honda engine and Honda clones, Predator engines, they're all the same. Throttle's right here, choke, fuel cutoff switch, and the engine kill switch. It's pretty simple. Everyone kind of has seen it before. It is a little complicated though, because you have all these controls all over the machine, so you're fiddling over here, and then you have to go to the other side of the engine. It is a little annoying compared to this Kohler, which actually has a nicer setup, being that the throttle control also acts like the kill switch and the choke. The problem is how they executed that, and it just feels cheap. Anytime I move the throttle to the choke position, I feel like I'm about to break it. That's just me. And these notches right here, the indents where it falls into position to let you know that you have engaged the choke, I feel like they're never in the right spot, and you have to still fiddle with it. It is kind of annoying, but I do like that when you put it all the way to idle, it actually kills the engine instead of having the using a little switch. So there is one advantage I see the Kohler having, and that is the gas tank is made of plastic. So you don't have to worry about the gas tanks rusting out. I have replaced so many gas tanks on Honda engines, the clones, I've replaced them so many times because they just rust out, especially with the ethanol gas. They sit in the tank, it varnishes, it just rusts them out. But replacing the tanks isn't terribly difficult, and the tanks themselves are really cheap aftermarket. If you ever have to replace this tank, I guarantee you it's not going to be cheap. But I do like it for the fact that it doesn't rust. I'm going to talk briefly about the shroud and the recoil differences on the Honda and the Honda clones and the Kohler engine. So the shrouds on these, they're made of metal. The recoils are also made of metal. And the recoils can be very easily replaced. They can be rotated in any position depending on what they're on. It's just, it works. And parts are cheap. You can get all those for really cheap. If they do break or rust out, I have seen them rust out, but they're really easy to replace, so it's not really that big of a deal. So the shroud on the Kohler is completely made out of plastic, and so is the recoil, but that's not the worst part. The recoil is molded into the shroud. So if the recoil goes bad, you got to replace the entire assembly. And that's probably going to be pretty expensive. And they crack too. So right here, and this is, like I said, 1 year old. There's already a crack in this cheapo plastic. So I'm not sure how long these really will last. The biggest thing that surprised me about the Kohler engine is that it had an aluminum bore. Magnet don't stick to aluminum. That's very surprising. So that's something that I would expect out of a Briggs & Stratton. They've been using an aluminum bore for years. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just won't last as long as a cast iron sleeve. Here's cast iron, and it's sticking. That's on a Honda clone. Hondas also have cast iron cylinder walls. Except for the GC series, they do not. But the GX series do. And apparently the RH series, based on a little bit of research, they don't have radial ball bearings on the crankshaft either. It is a plain bearing. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of Briggs & Strattons had that. But this is on a wood chipper. All that weight and all the force of that big rotating disc is going on a plain bearing instead of a radial ball bearing like it should. All Hondas, all GX series Hondas, have radial ball bearings, and even most of the Honda clones have radial ball bearings. Now, why doesn't the Kohler have radial ball bearings? It's probably to make it even cheaper. So anyway, overall, the Kohler RH series, by the way, this is a 6.5 horsepower 196cc. That's funny. 196cc is the exact same displacement as a GX200. And most of the Honda clones, they're all 196cc, so it should be no coincidence that this should also be 196cc. Gone are the days of the old Kohler K series that would run and run and run and ask for more, and the old Briggs & Strattons that would just run forever too. They were great too. Kohler makes some good engines nowadays still. They've made their Kohler Command for a very long time. By this point, they're pretty much ironed out all the issues that they had with them. Even the Kohler Command single cylinders, those are also really good. A lot of lawn tractors have them, a few walk-behinds too. But what replaced the single cylinder Kohler Command was the Courage, and that's an absolute pile of garbage. So to conclude this video, it's pretty disappointing and unfortunate that Kohler as a company is starting to fall into the trap of producing cheap consumable products, once regarded as a very good quality engine manufacturer, now producing junk.